in a very basic way, you want literature to matter, that's all. It doesn't have to cause a revolution. I mean, I wouldn't trust it if it caused a revolution. But you want people to read books.
Welcome to How I Wrote This, a show about writers, their books, and the story behind their stories. I'm Pamela Hensley, and on the show today, Jonathan Garfinkel talks about life in Berlin as a Jewish expat, his adventures staging plays in Georgia and the Ukraine, and how the power of individual stories helped him look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a way he had previously ignored. Jonathan is a Canadian playwright, poet, and novelist who got his start in theatre in Georgia in the early 2000s under Paul Thompson, a former director of the National Theatre School. His plays include the Trials of John Demjhanjuk, a Holocaust Cabaret, the controversial show about a man accused of being Ivan the Terrible, House of Many Tongues, which won him a nomination for the Governor General's Award, about the residents of a house in Gaza shared by an Israeli and a Palestinian, and Cockroach, the play adapted from the novel by Rawi Hage. Jonathan has also published essays, poetry, and memoir, and in 2023 his debut novel, In a Land Without Dogs, the Cats Learn to Bark. He joins me in the studio in Berlin. Jonathan Garfinkel, you've lived in Berlin for a number of years now, but you're a Canadian originally from Toronto. What drew you to this city?
I came here in the 90s en route to visit the villages of my grandparents in eastern Poland, a Jewish Ashkenaz background. So I'd always wanted to visit to visit where I came from, so to speak. And Berlin was it was a kind of mecca in the 90s for artists, and I was a young poet, and I thought I should begin my trip here. And I'm going to say that my first time here in the late 90s was a November day like today, and I hated this place.
Yeah, you're not coming for the weather, are you?
The summer, if you come in the summer, you can get seduced. But if you come in November, you're probably not going to be very impressed by the place. It was dour, it was miserable, it was freezing. I mean, certain things did strike me. One was that I went to the Jewish Museum designed by Libeskind. And at the time, you could get a tour of the museum before there was anything in it. And I thought it was quite a moving and profound experience. And it resonated with me. After that first trip, I just found myself, I kept coming back here. So what began as a trip of wanting to look into my own past, my familial past, became a place of connection with people in the present, with artists, writers. I have a lot of good friends here. I feel oddly at home here. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When we first met, you'd just written the article for the Globe and Mail describing the escalating tension in the city in light of the war between Israel and Palestine, a region that you write about. But you were writing the article as a Jewish expat, essentially reporting on your comfort level. That's how I read it. Do you feel comfortable here now?
Yeah, I feel more comfortable than I did a few weeks ago. Mm. It's a complicated situation in Germany. Mm. I mean, people are... I've written about Israel and Palestine, and I've written critically about it while growing up in that world of Judaism and Zionism, and I've questioned a lot of the world I've come from. I felt comfortable as a North American Jew doing that. It feels less easy to do that here because of the historical realities of this place.
Are you finding the conversations are inhibited?
I find the private conversations are not. The public conversations are a little bit more. But, I always willing to listen and to observe because I'm not in it. I mean, none of us are in it unless you're living in Israel or Gaza. So I can actually take my time, speak to people. I have Palestinian friends, I have Israeli friends, and those are the people I tend to talk to and I'm interested in talking to. And I will say that there's been a very interesting level of engagement in that sense here.
So you've talked about growing up Jewish in North America. And I'm curious just to know a little bit more about that. It was a traditional Jewish family. You went to a Jewish school.
That's right.
Okay.
Actually, it was a labor Zionist school, secular labor Zionist, sort of Hebrew immersion. My family was not diehard Zionist, actually, at all. We were observant. We went to synagogue every Saturday. Over time, I would say the nuclear family, my nuclear family, we sort of all have gone in our own directions with our own relationship to Judaism. It's evolved. I've been very interested in it from a cultural and historical standpoint, and that's something I've written about quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting thing to watch that evolution.
But you embraced it as a child. You embraced your faith.
I embraced it, absolutely. Yeah, I was a believer. I loved it in a way that maybe my younger brothers did not. I mean, I think they might have found it hard because they found it like they were having it stuffed down their throats. For me, it wasn't an obligation, but it was a sort of rich world that I connected to, and I haven't let go of that. I mean, I'm basically an atheist. I'm anti-nationalist. I'm all these things I was not brought up on. But there's something about the language and the cultural aspects of it that I haven't let go of and continue to return to, because that's the kind of imprint that we all have. I mean, we all carry our childhoods with us in a sense, and are always responding to it in a way. And we can't escape that. No. And as a writer, that's been very important to me. You know, when I started writing in my late teens, I don't know what I thought you had to do. I guess I thought of the beats or something like that. You had to go on some traveling adventures and find yourself and blah, blah, blah. And then at a certain point in my 20s, I realized, well, I actually don't need to find myself. I can kind of draw on myself. There's a lot there. And, you know, I will say that a lot of my life has involved a lot of travel, a lot that has politicized me and made me a sort of citizen of the world rather than of one country. And but I do return to those blueprints, not because they're more right than any other. It's the one I know.
Mm-hmm. I liked one of the things you wrote in an article. It described your childhood view of God as this Orwellian God that is a camera in the corner watching you and playing it back while you sleep. Was that a natural conclusion from the lessons you were taught? Or
it just seemed, yeah. I mean, it seemed straightforward to me, that I was like an MTV video for God or something. You know, we all, God's watching all of his channels of us living in our lives. And of course, when you're a child and you're taught about, in my case, it was the Jewish God, who judges, who assesses. It's one's private thoughts that are up for grabs, in a sense.
There's a bit of a negative connotation there, though. Did you feel that, or did you?
I didn't feel it as in a negative way. I just thought it was. I mean, yes, Orwellian there's a negative connotation with that. I just kind of accepted it.
Yeah.
As one does as a child.
That's right.
And then as an adult, you question it, right?
Yeah. What about your interest in the arts? You said you were writing poetry already around 18. Were your parents involved in theater, or were
not really?
Any ideas where it came from?
Yes. I mean, my grandmother loved the opera. She used to always listen to Saturday afternoons at the Met. Both my parents are huge readers. But my father was a psychiatrist, and so he was from the medical academic world, and that was familiar to me. Mm-hmm. And I was good at science, and I had studied, I had taken all the sciences, but always loved literature and always thought of the fact that I loved to write. People like the Marx Brothers were huge influences on me. Monty Python and SCTV. I loved skit humor. I loved comedy.
And satire.
I love satire. Yeah, that was the stuff I loved. And then I got into like Aldous Huxley and all that stuff in my teens. And I was actually enrolled in science at McGill at the age of 18. And I was reading the Beats for the first time, and I saw people who were making life out of literature. And that really excited me. And I just thought, oh, you can do that. And I hadn't realized you could do that. I think growing up in a sort of comfortable middle class world, I just didn't think about that. I didn't consider that. And I found myself at the age of 18, I was in Montreal on the mountain, and I took some magic mushrooms for the first time, and I had a kind of vision. It was maybe a kind of Leonard Cohen moment or something, but I had this idea that I was somehow passive in my life and not expressing whatever it was I am, and that I needed to do that. And I decided that night I would commit to writing. And the next day I started to write, and my writing was terrible. I was absolutely, especially my poetry, especially. But for some reason the vision stuck, and I can't say that about a lot of other things, in my life. And I'm actually currently writing something about diabetes and illness, and my own relationship to chronic illness. I've lived with diabetes for almost 40 years. And for me, what I've come to understand through writing about it is how writing has played a role for me to feel more at home in my body and more at home in the world. And I say that not to get, distantly philosophical, but to actually say that writing for me actually is a place of comfort. And it's not that it's easy, and it's not that it's always enjoyable at all. I find it especially editing, quite painful. But there's something that feels very comfortable and important to me.
Did you finish your degree, or did you switch programs? Or
I switched into philosophy and finished my degree in Victoria, British Columbia, where they had some creative writing. I did a creative writing minor, and I experienced my first writing workshops, which I didn't love. But I think I was looking for artistic parents. And in time, in my early 20s, I met a theater director in Toronto named Paul Thompson, who was one of the pioneers of English-Canadian theater. He helped start Theatre Passe-Muraille in Toronto. He ran the National Theatre School in the late 80s and 90s. He's worked with all kinds of great writers like Timothy Finley and Michael Ondaatje. But he worked in a collective capacity, so there was never a script in his plays, and it was all improvised through acting. And we gravitated towards each other. We met at a party, and he had a lifetime award for two tickets for any play in Ontario for the rest of his life. It's called the Silver Ticket Award. And I was, I think, 23, 24, and he asked if I liked the theater, and I said I did. I hadn't really seen much of contemporary alternative theater. And this was my education into theater. I'd never even thought of writing plays. I had no training, but I loved dialogue. I liked to write dialogue, and I'd always liked that. And somebody like Mordecai Richler was a big inspiration for me in that regard because his dialogue is so great.
And he's funny. So this is how you got into theater.
Exactly.
Because I'm sort of jumping ahead here, but in the early 2000s, you then went to Eastern Europe, I believe, to Georgia.
That's
and
right.
Worked in theater.
I went with Paul. In fact.
Paul. Okay.
So there's the perfect bridge. In 2002, I had done already two projects with him. As always at a party with Paul, usually involved a lot of wine. He said to me, "How do you feel about going to Georgia?" And I was like, I didn't even know where it was. I knew it from the Beatles song Back in the USSR, and I knew Stalin was born there. That's about all I knew. And so we went in 2002. It was a very dark time there. It was a very difficult time. The place had basically collapsed since the end of the Soviet Union. It was a mess of a country. Shevardnadze was running it, but kind of like a fiefdom. It was black market everything. The bribery and corruption was intense. There was rarely electricity or running water or heat. And we arrived in the winter. We went and saw dozens of plays in Georgian, which neither of us spoke, but it was wild. And a lot of it was brilliant stuff. The Robert Sturua, who I mentioned in my novel, we saw his Hamlet, which was brilliant at the Rustaveli. We saw his 27-year-old production at the time of the Caucasian Chalk Circle. It was actually an amazing time, an inspiring time for me as a young writer, as just to watch people so immersed in their art. And then we ended up at a place called the Basement Theater, which in my novel is called the Underground. And while watching a 3.5-hour production of The Marriage of Figaro in Georgian, I decided I need to stretch my legs. And there was a very drunk man at the bar, and he asked where I was from. I mean, there just weren't any foreigners there then, where they are now. And I told him I was from Canada and that I was a theater artist and writer. And it was Levan Suladze who ran the theater and was the director of the play. And he was quite drunk.
And the director of the Underground.
And the director of the Underground. And he took me into the actor's change room. And he's like, I was like, well, what about the play? He's like, don't worry about the play. We're going to drink. And he took out a bottle of cha-cha and the sort of Georgian grappa, mystery grappa, and we drank. And then Paul joined us afterwards, and then a kind of friendship and camaraderie had been established. And we ended up hanging out with him, his family, the theater people around him.
Did you end up working in that theater?
We ended up working a year later. So we came back with 5 Canadian actors the next year. They gave us the bar to rehearse in, which we often did by candlelight because there was often not electricity. And we created a play with some Georgian actors and a musician, and we even had set designers from there working with us. But, so the cross-cultural exchange was more of us learning from them, I would say. But in the end, we put on a play for Georgian audiences for 4 nights, and it was quite an exciting experience.
Well, I'm wondering how theater is seen in Georgia. Like, is there something different about how it's received by people?
Absolutely. I mean, this is my perception. It's not necessarily reality, but for me, theater seemed life or death over there. I mean, actually, this is not just my perception. The facts on the ground were, especially at the Basement Theater, the Sardape, the houses were full every night. They were all with people under 30 years old. And there was something dissident in my mind going on, and in the way people gathered and the way things were done. But I mean, I will also say that Georgians culturally are very theatrical and dramatic, and lends itself well to the theatrical form. I mean, if you look at the writing of Nino Haratischwili, who's a great Georgian German novelist, who also started in the theater as a playwright and director, her novels are full of drama. I mean, it's like high-pitched drama for 800 pages, which is amazing.
How do you sustain that?
I don't know how she does it, but she does it, and I think it works beautifully. Some don't, but is that part of Georgian? This is part of my experience of Georgian culture is like that. But for a young writer who was trying to understand what his own voice was, it was hugely instructive.
Sounds like almost like an apprenticeship.
It was. I mean, in my years with Paul were an apprenticeship, and the time in Georgia was a true apprenticeship because I felt like I was in a world where art really mattered and writing really mattered. Of course, you grow up in the world you grow up in, and you can't change that. And it's not like I was going to move to Georgia and become a Georgian. I thought about it, but I mean, I wasn't going to become a great Georgian writer. I mean, I didn't feel like that was my story to write, even though I did write a novel about it. But maybe that is why I decided to write a book about it. It was because I wanted to write about a place where I felt like art and literature and theater had a life and death quality to it, that it sustained people. Because that's, in some ways, you want literature. I mean, in a very basic way, you want literature to matter.
Right.
That's all. It doesn't have to cause a revolution. I mean, I wouldn't trust it if it caused a revolution. But you want people to read books.
Yeah.
And you want people
to think. Right. Yes.
And I mean, it was that internal need to connect to a place where I felt literature mattered. But then, of course, it became something else.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about your first play.
Okay.
First of all, is it true that the Trials of John Demjhanjuk, the Holocaust Cabaret, began as a poem?
That is true. It actually wasn't my first play.
Okay.
My first play was called Walking to Russia. It was not published, but it was produced. And I guess it was a kind of, that was a kind of magic realist response to my grandparents and their generation and me wanting to kind of connect to their homeland. So it was about those villages of theirs that I went back to. The Demjhanjuk play did begin as a poem, and my girlfriend at the time, who was a theater director, unknowingly had submitted the poem to an experimental theater festival in Toronto, and then it got accepted. I was really into Bertolt Brecht at the time, and I thought, what a perfect way to use poetry in a play and songs. I mean, for a Holocaust war crimes trial.
Well, all right, yeah, the play, which is then staged. It was staged in 2004.
That's right.
It's about the trials of a man named John Demjhanjuk, who was accused of being Ivan the Terrible, this particularly sadistic guard at the Treblinka.
Yeah.
What drew you to his story?
It's a good question. I mean, in the late 90s, it's an amazing story.
I remember it because he worked at the Cleveland engine plant.
That's right.
And I worked at the Windsor engine plant. And I understand that world and how the anonymity of someone can lead you to question everything about them.
Yeah, I think that it was the second Holocaust war crimes trial in Israel after Eichmann. It was done in a former theater, so there was a very theatrical element to the whole thing. Mm-hmm. But I got excited by it, or intrigued by it, I should say, in the late 90s when I read that they were reopening the case in Munich, not for Ivan of Treblinka, because he had been found in the appeal not guilty through his Israeli defense lawyer, Yoram Sheftel. After the fall of the Soviet Union, KGB documents came out showing that he was clearly not Ivan of Treblinka. But the Munich case in Germany reopened, eventually sent him to Munich in 2009, a trial I went to, mm-hmm. Where he was tried as an accessory to murder at Sobibor death camp.
The story is itself, it's so
incredible.
Convoluted.
It
yeah.
is.
I mean, and I thought you dealt with it masterfully. Like there's 3 different countries. There's the US, there's Israel, and there's Munich, and there's Germany. Yeah. And then there's different trials, there's different verdicts, but you don't get caught up in the weeds at all.
No, I think the Brecht device helped me. I mean, using songs and kind of making it uberly theatrical. The use of humor, it helped me create some I'm not saying it was an easy thing to write. But there's been some great books written on the subject. I did a lot of research. I watched footage from the trials. I mean, the Jerusalem trial was incredibly dramatic. You had
the survivor testimony.
Yeah. It was brutal, and they were so sure that it was him, and the fact that they could have been wrong was equally upsetting. And Demjanjuk's defense lawyer Sheftel. It was a controversial figure,
yes,
to say the least.
Yeah,
he liked taking on drug lords and other unsavory characters. He made a lot of money as a defense lawyer. And
he drove a Porsche,
white Porsche, and all the rest. But it was also very theatrical, but it allowed me to kind of jump in to post-Holocaust memory. Which is something as a Jew who grew up at a Zionist day school, I was inundated with this from early education. So this was a great way of writing about it, a great way of talking about it.
You mentioned how you approached it with song and jokes and these things. Why does humor work with such a terrible topic?
Humor is, first of all, humor is distancing. I mean, it's a great old Jewish trick. Mm-hmm. It's a way of survival. It's a way of looking at the horrible in ways that it's really hard to when up close. I mean, the tragedy of it, of course, and there's plenty of tragedy in the play. It's not all song and jokes. For me, my Jewish spirit is very much tied to the comedy mixed with the tragic, and I mean, Tony Kushner talks about the way humor opens the audience up, and then you can kind of go drive in the harder stuff. And that's sort of the way I seem to work. So I don't like to shy away from the tragedy, and nor do I look at the humor in a glib sort of way. But there's the fact that humor does open up an audience. It also makes people uncomfortable, I find, especially if it's about uncomfortable subjects, to be laughing at it. It also reflects onto who we are as people and our own discomfort with certain subjects, with certain parts of ourselves. It allows you to really kind of play with taboo as well, which I'm really interested in. I don't know, if you look at it as compositionally, I just can't have it in that kind of one note in a way. I mean, I can get lost in the note of sadness, you know?
Yeah.
So humor helps open things up for me.
The play was staged in Toronto, in Heidelberg, and some other Eastern European cities. I'm interested in the difference in reception.
Well, I mean, it actually played several places in Canada. It played in Ottawa and played Vancouver and Victoria as well. In Heidelberg, it was very well received, but they went very hard on the Nazi character. It was intense. It was a very different production. It was very acerbic. And then it was actually part of the news cycle when the Demjhanjuk trial was sort of at its peak in Munich. So it got picked up in a lot of the French, German, and Russian news channels. And then I got a phone call from a guy in St. Petersburg, a Russian theater director who wanted to translate into Russian and do a production in Russia and Ukraine. I was like, sure, if you could, I kind of didn't believe this was going to happen. And then sure enough, it did actually come together. I ended up going to the Ukrainian premiere in Kiev in 2017. And boy, was that an experience, because they focused on the cabaret element of it big time. Like they turned it into a giant musical.
I was thinking they might have focused on his background. He's from the Ukraine.
That's what I was worried about, because it sort of shows them as, well, the Demjhanjuk story was sensitive because it showed them as in their complicity during the Holocaust. And that was the point of sensitivity, and that's what I was expecting in Ukraine. But because they weren't really focusing so much on the Demjhanjuk story, but the musical, what happened was several hours before I was supposed to go to the airport in Montreal to Kiev, the chief rabbi of Kiev went to the synagogue that morning and saw across the street at the Belle Epoque Theater, where the play was supposed to open 2 days later, all it said was Holocaust Cabaret. And I think this was also on the day of Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Memorial Day. And so I started getting all these hate messages on my Facebook wall. And then a panicked phone call from the producer and theater director going, we don't know what to do. And then I was like, well, should I get on the plane? Is this, a good idea? And they're like, and they had a private consultation. They said, yes, we think you should come and defend your play. And I was like, why am I defending my play? I don't even know you guys. I'm coming for the premiere with my Canada Council grant, Anyhow, I went. And the play was canceled at the Belle Epoque Theater.
Did you talk to the rabbi?
The rabbi didn't want to talk to me.
Oh.
But by this point, it had become a shit show. For about 5 days, I was on every news station. I had a press conference. Sorry, I had several press conferences. I've never been in a press conference, but I had several press conferences defending the play, explaining why I had written it the way I had. But it was not, I wasn't being angered. People weren't angry about Demjhanjuk. They thought I was an anti-Semite. And that I had to explain why this was an important play, why this was an important story, why I chose to do it in this way. And there was a second theater that had said they would put it on. And then the next day they canceled because they were getting pressure from the Ukrainian Secret Service to cancel it. We were being followed by the Ukrainian Secret Service. I don't know why it was politicized, but it was. Anyhow, the play went on. It was the Russian cast with a Ukrainian jazz band. It was actually a wild... And then I remember sitting, as I'm sitting... This is
why you like theater.
Yeah, it's very dramatic. As I'm sitting in the audience, I'm thinking, and the lights go down finally after a week of all this mayhem, and I'm going, what if I don't I like the play? What if it is anti-Semitic? I mean, I don't know what these guys have done.
We'll be back after this. This is a bit like your life, though, I think, Jonathan, because even before this happened, you had a big year. You were back in Toronto. You were sort of struggling, actually, with faith. And you met a woman who told you about a house in Palestine where she had lived. It was shared between Jewish and Arab families. And then you decided you wanted to go to Israel and Palestine. So all of this going on even before the whole Georgia thing happened. You sound kind of busy.
Well, I mean, at the time, I think I thought I needed to go to these places to really understand them, which is maybe not a bad thing, as a writer. And that led me to one of the many things I do, which is sort of long-form journalism. And it's not the beatnik thing of I need to go on an adventure and find myself. It's actually going to these places. And going to Israel and Palestine really was a really transformative experience because it was during the Second Intifada. I went in search of this house, which I did eventually find, which was not easy to find.
So it was not a mythical house.
It was not a mythical house. I spent a lot of time in the West Bank interviewing, speaking to Palestinians, spent time in the refugee camps. I spent time with settlers, Jewish settlers. I spent time with artists in Tel Aviv. I mean, with my Canadian passport, I was afforded the privilege to travel through these worlds in ways that Israelis or Palestinians would never be able to do. And that was completely life-changing.
Well, you wrote a book about it.
I wrote a book and a play.
Yeah. But you called it Ambivalence, Crossing the Israeli-Palestinian Divide. Why had you become ambivalent?
Well, I think that after my we'll go back to Bialik, the Hebrew school I went to, the Zionist school I went to. I knew my Zionist history backwards and forwards. The Balfour Declaration, the White Paper, the UN partition plan. I mean, these were things that I grew up on, and as well as the Holocaust education. And what happened was I did all this intense learning until the age of 14. And then I went to a public school, and then I went to university, and I kind of shelved the whole Zionist thing. I wasn't really interested in going to Israel, and I kind of just avoided it, to be honest.
But where were your doubts coming from?
The doubts started coming when I started really thinking about Israel and thinking about what my place within Judaism as an adult was. And it was actually related to coming to Berlin, and it was related to going to the villages of my grandparents, the shtetls, and connecting to my Ashkenaz Jewish heritage, that I was like, okay, great, I can get into the history, I can get into the literature. These are things I'm into. But what does it actually mean to be Jewish now? And part of that meant looking into what my relationship to what Israel was, because the Israel of the 90s, where it, from the outside perspective, it looked fairly good in retrospect. And the Israel of the early 2000s with the Second Intifada, it had shifted. There was already a huge shift. I'm not saying that the problems just began in the early 2000s, but I was aware of the problems, and I will say I came to it rather innocently. But like I do with any of my writing, I decided to dive into research. I ended up at this Palestinian film at the Toronto Film Festival, Elias Suleiman, Divine Intervention, and that upset me in a way that any news I'd been reading or any book by Noam Chomsky I'd been reading about that criticized Israel, it upset me in a much more deep way, because Suleiman uses humor. And Suleiman used what I felt was Jewish humor. And I thought, oh my God. And that felt...
And it opened you up.
It opened me up, and it felt authentic, because you can't make up that kind of experience.
Right.
And as he called it in the talk after the screening, It was what he called ghetto humor. I went up to try and talk to him afterwards. He sort of brushed me aside, and I met this woman, Rana, who told me who I met for coffee, and she was Palestinian. She lived in Toronto, and we became friends. And she told me about this house in Jerusalem that she'd rented a room in, but shared between an Israeli and a Palestinian. And I became intrigued by it. And that was my entry point into Israel, Palestine. And everything changed for me after that. And meeting a Palestinian like Rana meant seeing the human side of their story, which I tried to ignore for so many years. And I think the longer you ignore the specifics of the situation, the history, which means ignoring the stories of other people, the more you dehumanize other people's stories and experiences. Of course, it didn't begin with the wall. It didn't begin with the Second Intifada. There's 75 years of history here. It's something that I have always found difficult to talk about, and yet I wrote a book about it, but I wrote a book about it because it was so difficult to talk about. And like I have trouble, I mean, this is partly why I hate the social media conversation right now. I don't speak in memes, you know, and that's, literature allows us to not speak in memes.
You wrote the play House of Tongues about this house that you found where it was shared and people lived together. You said I think it was in the foreword of that play, you said that you find claims people make against land irrational. Why?
Well, I think that the claims that I'm talking about are more the argument of, well, sorry, there's a rational part of it, of course. It's like, I was here first. No, I was here first. That's the basic argument. I mean, that's the argument, right? The question really, for me, is, and maybe irrational isn't the right word, but maybe the real question is, what do you do? I mean, for me, the Israelis aren't going anywhere and the Palestinians aren't going anywhere. And the real tragedy is that nothing has ever been resolved. You can blame whoever the hell you want, but people have to find a way to coexist. And that's why I like the story of Abu Dalu and Shimon, the two men who live, sorry, I shouldn't say they live in the same house. The truth is that Shimon, the Moroccan Jew, rents Abu Dalu's father's old house, and Abu Dalu, the son, lives across the street. Okay?
That's close enough.
Close enough. And what is important for me about that model is that they don't speak to each other. They hate each other's guts, but they don't kill each other. And that's
as good as
that's
you
not
can get.
So bad. I mean, you don't have to love each other. We just need them not to kill each other.
In your play, House of Tongues, a teenage boy is obsessed with, let's say, oral sex.
Yes.
My mother listens to this show. And his father's kind of lost in the past. The father was a general in the Israeli army who took over an empty house when he stopped fighting. And when the play opens, it's 15 years later, and a Palestinian comes knocking on the door with the deed in his hands. What can go wrong? But you were talking about how when you looked at individual stories, this is when things came clear to you. Yeah. There was a line in the play where the son asked the father, how did you feel when you saw people living in refugee camps and not homes? And if you boil it down to the individual, it's hard not to know what the right thing to do is. Yeah.
I mean, it's really about seeing each other's humanity. I follow a lot of the media in Israel and coming from the Arabic world as well right now. And hearing from people themselves is, for me, much more important than the analysis, the distant analysis. I mean, like, I'm totally being hypocritical here. I'm distant. I'm not in it, you know?
But you're listening to individual stories, you're saying.
That's my way through it. And it's not, I'm not trying to say everybody necessarily should do this. I'm doing this because I find it confusing, because history is confusing, and the history of colonialism in Palestine is confusing. And I mean, I'm talking like British colonialism, Ottoman colonialism. I mean, there's histories of occupation there. And what do you do? And how do these people live? I mean, you know, A great political compromise is needed.
In your play, which was nominated for Governor General's Award in 2011, it seems like you want hope and love to be the answers.
Well, I just said, the ideal is to live next to each other, not kill each other. So the play let me kind of float into the mythologies and ideologies of the region. When you think about what they're fighting over and the tiny pieces of land that we're talking about, it's actually kind of mind-boggling. Mm-hmm. Gaza is tiny. Israel's tiny. I mean, the distance from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv is less than an hour. And it's not to diminish the problem. It's just that we're talking about a tiny piece of land that takes on mythical proportions.
Mm-hmm. Your next play, it also wraps itself around a problem. You staged Cockroach based on Rawi Hage's novel of the same name. How did that come about?
I was subletting Rawi's apartment in Montreal, and his book was lying around. I mean, I was an admirer of De Niro's Game. I mean, I am a huge
great book.
It's a great book. Yeah. I'm a huge admirer of Rawi, and we actually met in Berlin when he was doing a DAD fellowship. We were playing soccer. There were a bunch of Canadian writers here, and somebody rented a soccer field, and Rawi and I were on it. I can't remember who. I think Miriam Tays was there. There were a bunch of Ken Babstock was there too. There was a bunch of Canadian writers playing soccer. And when I moved to Montreal because I got a job teaching at the National Theatre School playwriting, we met for coffee, and he happened to need someone to sublet his place, so I took his apartment. And I told him I'd read Cockroach and loved it, but I didn't. That's it. I was like, yeah, great book. Great. I mean, congrats, And he was like, I've always thought that would make a great play. And I was like, he says to a playwright. And I was like, okay. And then I read it. I didn't say anything. I read it again, and I thought, yeah, this would make a great play, but you lose the internal world of prose, which Rawi does so well. It's almost Dostoevsky-like. But the tone is so big, and then what happens when you strip that away? And so I said that to him. He's like, well, if you think of something, do it. And I pitched it to the Alberta Theatre Projects in Calgary.
Next thing you know.
The next thing I know, I had a grant to write it. I got the rights. I enjoyed it. I considered it a kind of collaboration between Rawi and myself, even though he didn't write it. I mean, he wrote the novel. But
was he involved in the production at all?
He wasn't, but he okayed the script. And he was excited by it.
So Cockroach it takes critical aim at how Canada treats its immigrants.
Exactly.
I've heard the term parallel societies used to describe the same thing in Germany, meaning you've got these two different experiences and they're side by side, but they never intersect.
Sort of the myth of multiculturalism.
Yeah. Do you think the situation has changed since either the book was written or
in Montreal?
Play? Anywhere.
Okay, well, I can speak to Germany because, for example, I live in Wedding, and Berlin has changed a lot since the Syrian war. 1 million Syrian refugees or so came here, not to Berlin, but to Germany. Mm-hmm. But that changed the makeup of the city. I think there's been an attempt for more integration here. I feel like Germany has a lot of difficulties with knowing how to integrate migrants. I mean, you look at the Turkish foreign workers who've been here for generations and who don't even have German passports. Mm-hmm. There are real legal challenges to being a foreigner here. And I'm not talking about a Canadian foreigner, a Turkish foreigner.
Yes, there are different types of foreigners here.
There are different types of foreigners. Yeah. So I believe that the problem hasn't gone away.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your latest book.
Okay, yes.
Well, in 2023, your novel called, it's your debut novel actually, right? Yeah. Called In a Land Without Dogs, The Cats Learn to Bark. That's a great title, by the way.
Thank you.
It's a Georgian proverb.
Yeah.
It deals with corruption, thugs, pro-democracy activists in a lawless Eastern European country desperate to change, that is Georgia. There's violence, a few murders, lots of deception. It reads like a wild romp. Was it fun to write?
It was very much fun at times. I mean, I think I had the most fun with it in the pandemic. I had a lot of trouble figuring out how to tell the story. So, but once I had the structure figured out, it was great. But it went from a place of autofiction to what I would call a weird take on historical fiction. But I mean, I soon wrote myself out of the book, which I'm glad. But I want to do it in a very weird, like not a weird way. It's doing discredit to it. I want to do it in an unusual way. I want it to be imaginative. I wanted to be a page turner. But I wanted to make a nod to the spy thriller and have plenty of comedy and absurdity and darkness.
I think you said at your reading that it took almost 10 years to bring out.
That's right. I did multiple drafts.
Right.
It was a bit of I probably learned how to write a novel through it as well. I mean, a novel is not a memoir, and it's certainly not a play. Then again, I did take on several decades of Georgian history, and it's not like I'm from there. I took on a lot. And for me, I felt audacious taking on the Georgian voices, and I felt uncomfortable at first. Then I decided, I gave myself permission by understanding it as an act of empathy and imagination. And I also researched the hell out of it. So I never pretended to be Georgian. So I felt like, okay, this is actually one of the things literature can do. It can be empathetic. It can cross cultures and genders and boundaries, and it should.
Yeah.
It should.
One of the characters is repeatedly told that no one is who they say they are. Is this a symptom of the conditions of the people living in places like Georgia, or is it a comment on people in general?
It's both. I mean, I think it's a comment on the Soviet duplicitous experience, the two-facedness of people. There's the public and private dimensions.
Yeah.
That becomes, though, a commentary about what it means to be human. I think that nobody is who they say they are in a way. And then this is another thing that I find troubling with social media is we're always performing, in a sense, on it. But that's also interesting, right?
Just maybe we could end with a few questions about craft itself. If you've got an idea or a story in your head, how do you know what format, what genre you're going to go after?
Good question. I mean, I think it has to do with the kind of story and the size of the story, so to speak. The Demjhanjuk story, the way I wanted to tell the trial, had to be a play. The Georgian novel had to be a novel. It does take time to figure out what it is I'm writing. But in the case of something like a novel or a memoir like Ambivalence, it usually starts with something small. In the case of Ambivalence, it started with a magazine article. I wrote a feature for the Walrus magazine in 2006, about a house in Jerusalem, about the guys, Abdullah and Shimon in Jerusalem. And the first draft came in at 25,000 words. And my editor was like,
this is not an article.
What the hell? And then he was also like, it's actually all very interesting. I think you have a book here. So, I mean, I don't know what I have. I just write. And I write about what interests me.
Do you work on one project at a time, or do you intersperse your projects?
I intersperse, though I
imagine that would be easier with poetry.
It's easier with the smaller projects to intersperse those while you're working on a larger project. And a larger project, you either get to the end of a draft or you just need a break to do something else.
Right?
Yeah. So that's how I do the different projects. I mean, I probably, in doing all the different genres, add on weight, because I feel like I've had to learn each form, and each one is not easy. The theater is very hard. It's all hard. Yeah. Poetry is extremely hard. To write a good poem. So I've probably spent so many years on trying to learn each form. If I had just stuck to one, maybe I would have had a few more books written, but it's okay. I get bored, so that's partly the other issue here.
You were talking about some of the books that you read, and in your novel, your characters read a lot of Russian literature. Who are you reading right now?
I'm reading a book called Human Smoke by Nicholson Baker, which is a really interesting nonfiction book about the end of World War I, sort of the interwar years leading up and through World War II. He's collected a lot of documentation from people like Winston Churchill, Hitler, and Goebbels, Goring, and then a whole bunch of stuff from pacifists like Gandhi and people from the American Pacifist League. And he doesn't comment on it, but he basically takes you through the years and the war, World War II, from a perspective I've never read before. I'm finding that very interesting.
Does he contrast them?
He contrasts them. I mean, I'm only halfway through, so I'm not exactly sure what it's all adding up to, so I don't want to say too much, but I do feel like it's asking a question of what, I mean, it's looking at the mechanisms of war. It's also about like the military industry and the way that was really kind of born around World War II and the weapons that were sold from which country to whichever other countries, the sort of things that go on behind the scenes that we don't see.
Does it make you angry when we do the same thing again?
That's what I'm kind of fascinated by. Is like I feel like I'm reading it going, this is exactly what's happening right now in Gaza. Does it make me angry? I think I'm past the anger point. Now I'm just like, God, I hope we make it to the next decade. I mean, it doesn't feel like a great time in humanity, and maybe it's just time to just say, okay, that's it. Let the earth regenerate.
Okay, we can't end on that note. So, okay. And we are in Berlin. So what about, let's see, Canadians maybe don't know a lot of German writers, or they haven't read all that many. Are there any German writers that you've read and would recommend?
I recently read Jenny Erpenbeck.
Oh, yeah, she's great.
Really, and she writes very well about the refugee migrant situation.
Go and Gone.
Go and Gone. Yeah. It's a very powerful book. I loved that book because it made me, like Cockroach, it took me into the lives of people that I brush up against, but I don't know very well.
Right.
A friend of mine, Tilman Rammstedt, very funny German writer, wrote a book called The King of China that I'm a big fan of. I mean, he gets bothered when I say he's the funniest German writer around, but it's like Thomas Bernhard funny. You know what I mean? It's like wickedly funny. Okay. I love Bernhard, but Bernhard's Austrian.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to think. I mean, I'm a big Paul Celan fan and Ingeborg Bachmann fan. Those are earlier German writers. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Nino Haratischwili is a great Georgian German writer, I think. Not very funny, but brilliant.
Dramatic.
I mean, dramatic. and I mean, she pulls no punches. And I appreciate that a better.
So right now you're completing a PhD in medical humanities at the University of Alberta.
Yeah, and that's my diabetes project, which is actually a literary memoir. It's a memoir.
Oh, okay.
And so I'm in the process of trying to edit it and submit it as a PhD, but I eventually would like to publish it as a book.
That and poetry.
Yeah. I'm exhausted just saying it all.
It is. Yeah. Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me here, Pamela.
That was Jonathan Garfinkel. How I Wrote This is produced and hosted by me, Pamela Hensley, and presented by Knockabout Media. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell a friend, follow us on your favorite podcast app, and consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It truly helps other listeners discover the show. Next week, join me as I speak with Andrea Wolf.
I don't want to just tell a story for the sake of this happened at some stage in history. I want to always reveal something about the present.
Knockabout Media Original. Hold on.